Okay, thank you, ladies. My project is on increasing kinship placements in order to try to expedite permanency for children of color that are in Lake County, specifically African American children. Here in Lake County, Indiana, we're typically known for one or two things, either as the crossroads of America because of our waterways, our traveling by semi or express, and our railways and such, or people know us as the murder capital city, which we do not take to that for ourselves. We are a close-knit community with strong ties and great relationships. And so we like to do hard work and come up with solutions for children and families. And we have made great strides in many areas. And so one of the areas that we have been very strategically focused on was getting kids to permanency, and still is. So back when we initially started taking a look at this process, we had upwards of 2,800 children involved and under the supervision of the Department of Child Services in Lake County, and we're down to around 1,000 kids that have achieved permanency or are back with their families or have found forever homes. So we're really glad about that. When we started looking more into the data, we started looking at this issue of children of color and how our current kids that we're dealing with, what and how our system has been affecting them. And this is where we started to do more research into kinship placements. So this particular project focused on the kinship placements of minority children, specifically African-American children in care. I'll be talking about my picot project and the improvement strategy, some of the disproportionality and racial disparities we found, a particular project that was already going on and what we had learned from it that was done by evaluation experts Eli Berry and Elizabeth Wilson, and then how I utilized implementation science in my project, thanks to Sherilyn, and then full implementation of this project, and then some partnering that we did with Casey Family Foundation, Casey Family Systems, to help with staff development to change hearts and minds of our staff. So basically, Lake County, Indiana is comprised of about 17.6% minority or African-American children specifically, in comparison to the rest of the state, which is about at 11.3%, which is more like the national standards. But the majority of our children in care does not look that way. When we look at the removals, and I'll be coming back to this slide later on, but I at least wanted to show in this initial slide that our removals of African-American children were at about 52% in 2019, and in 2018, they were at 46%. Of multiracial children were at about 10 and 11% respectively. And of white children, they were at about 43% and 37% in years 2018 and 2019. I'll explain in the project year those changes that occurred later on. So you can see that there is this dramatic difference in racial disparities in the number of Black children that were being removed during previous years compared to the population of them being 17.6% in our general population. So when we look at the average length of time that children of color remain in our care from the onset of us being involved till the time that we dismiss our case or reunite with families, the average amount of time in Lake County that a white child is involved in our system is about 350 days, or that's the median length, and the median length of time for An African American child is about 400 days, with lengths being as long as 700 days, and lengths being as long for white children at 500 days. And then the state average is mirroring about the same. So we do have some work to do when it comes to not only are we removing more African American children, but then the delay to permanency for them is also that they're staying involved in our system even longer. So observations from this, exactly how long it looks like on average for the last 3 years, African American children have been staying involved with our office for about 150 days longer than white children have been staying in care. When we are removing African American children, 1 out of 5 of them are placed with family, as opposed to overall 1 out of 3 children remaining in care in Lake County tend to be placed with family. And this was the impetus for this project, because ever since I can remember being involved as a supervisor, which is back in 2012, we have stayed around that 32 to 33% mark of children that are removed from the home being placed with family or fictive kin. We have not been able to move that lever until now. So really want to get into this project and excited about talking about it. So the picot was, if children of color in Lake County are placed in kinship home with supportive services and resources within 30 days of removal, is it more likely that they will be will receive racial equity and permanency outcomes? What I mean by supportive services are services that the family deems that they need at the time that we are in that home. An assessment would be done, which I'll talk about later, but those services could look like anything from concrete needs of rent, utilities, assistance, childcare, emergency financial support, medical assistance for the child or themselves, transportation, hygiene products, visitation needs, clothing, to assistance as in educational awareness of the child's behavioral needs or concerns, and parenting assistance, or what have you, that may be needed, and that those services are implemented within those 30 days. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how that plan rolls out. Would this lead to us seeing more equitable outcomes and expedited permanency? So our strategy rolled out by first trying to develop a plan that would require these educational services that I just discussed, and then us looking at trying to see if we could somehow measure whether this was leveling that gap of racial disparity, and seeing in the long term whether or not these children were getting to permanency more timely. So we'll talk about that and see if that actually came to fruition. So we started with this lean process called process mapping. And for those who may not be aware, lean is just a way of thinking about how to organize human activities to deliver more benefits to society. And lean requires us to look at eliminating waste, and also having respect for our clients while doing so. So when we look at process mapping, we were looking at an actual process that we utilize today and in time. So we were looking at, back here in January, this process of how do we see kinship placements out right now? What is it that we do? So that we can look at why we're only achieving 32% of our removals being placed with family. And so we don't go in with any judgment. We don't go in with any type of situations of looking at scrutinizing anything other than getting everybody at the table who's involved in this situation to say, what is it that we do when we're looking to place kids with family? What do we do from start to finish? And so everyone around the table just talked about what that process looked like. And as we went to talking about what that process looked like, we noticed a couple of things. We noticed that there were duplications in this process, such as the number of times that a worker reached out to a supervisor to talk about the steps that they were taking, whether it was, okay, this parent wasn't able to identify a relative, or they identified this relative, but I don't know about this person. Dad hasn't seen the child in 2 months. Dad doesn't know what school the child goes to. We were able to identify inefficiencies and waste in the process, such as the assigned case manager was doing the same thing that the kinship worker was doing. In our state, there's a separate worker that is specializing in kinship supports that is a state of Indiana worker, as well as the assessment worker who's evaluating and assessing, that's determining that removal process. So we were looking at that both parties at times were both looking at doing background checks. Both workers at times were focused on the same thing at the same time, and that some of these processes could be eliminated as they were operating in silos. Another thing that we looked at and noticed a pattern with was that there seemed to be this cultural trend of barriers that were building towards the no, as opposed to strategies that were strengthening the yes. So down at the lower part in blue were all things that instantly were leading to no's. And so I kind of targeted that as our areas of barriers, whether it was that the family's capacities were, housing was going to be a problem because it didn't look like there was enough space, or there were financial hardships, or it looked like the relatives had similar ideas that the parents had, so I don't know about this, or whatever sketchy means. I don't know, it seems to be sketchy. Lake County is a neighboring county, so it neighbors the state of Illinois. So we are very close to Chicago. You can see the skyline on a clear day. So ICPC was always a big issue and a big crutch. I'm going to just put that out there. So it's very easy to say, can't place, ICPC needed. Can't place with bio parent, even though that's not true, ICPC needed. And so there was always the barrier that built the no, that kind of shot it down, and easily able to pass on to the next person. So yes, thank you for that. ICPC meaning Interstate Compact for the Placement of Children, which is the permissions that were needed to place a child in another state. And so these barriers add up to getting in the way of that placement of that child with the relative. So where did we take this information? If we can transition to the next slide, can talk about that a little bit more. So we began to use this implementation science. As I said before, that Sherilyn wonderfully helped me to kind of organize all of this information that I gathered to help put it together for us to begin to do some really good groundwork. We gathered this multidisciplinary work group to talk about where we were and where we want to go and how we were going to get there. We did a lot of data mining into what things looked like before. We did the process mapping. We got a lot of good guidance and feedback. And at this point, I will pause to say thank you so much to my mentor, Ellis Dumas, because he was extremely strategic, and his ability to get us in the right spaces and in the right places to get with those stakeholders that were needed to get us the permissions that we needed to go forward, including with our state director who's on the line today. We addressed some technical and developmental assistance, including with data and how to address those disparities and how to interpret them from the Casey family programs. I coordinated a checklist. Someone mentioned before that Sherilyn loves those checklists. Yes, she does. And she helped me to create a checklist that organized the staff expectations. And then Casey family programs did come in and do some training for us, and I'll discuss that a little bit later on as well. I also would like to mention that there's a part of this going forward from that process mapping in which we did notice that our staff were concurrently seeking family while seeking foster care. So whichever one happened to have occurred first was kind of what happened during that process. So that was very eye-opening to us. And it's worth mentioning because a change had to be implemented at that time for us to be able to move forward. So one thing that we did implement at that time was to create in our safety planning, how is this child safe being in their placement, whether it was going to be safe at home or safe with relatives, and that we could not move forward unless there was something that was ensured with the parents who had to sign off on that to be in agreement that there were no identified family that could be found. And so it was a contract that had to be solution focused with parental buy-in before we could move forward to seek out any type of foster or foster home or licensing. So this really helped us in being able to go forward with our kinship placements or before we could look towards licensing. So what did our coordinated removal process actually look like? This was the actual intervention that was put in place. As previously stated, we have a kinship navigator program. We have kinship support specialists whose job is strategically focused on kinship seeking, kinship support, and then we have our assessment team who are focused on evaluating, determining safety, determining whether removals need to occur. The issue was that each works in silos, and how do we bring those two together? So when we first brought this program together, these two teams would work in tandem with one another, would go out together, would assess families together, whether it was night or day, whether it was weekends or holidays. And so together, this would be done in real time to determine not only when removals are occurring, who those identified family or fictive kin were, but what those needs were, and get those needs in place right at the onset. Those tangible needs, those services that were mentioned before, and make sure that all of these things were occurring within 48 hours of that placement. And as we all know, when mid-March hit, COVID kind of hit everything, and we had to do some adjustments. So we created a wonderful checklist that would discuss the expectations for staff members, whether it was the kinship specialist or the assessing case manager, to know how they would talk to each other and what expectations would be before and after hours and on holidays. This slide is basically discussing the need to adjust that, how it worked prior to COVID, and then what had to change after COVID. And simply the only changes that we made is that instead of that kinship specialist going out on nights and weekends, like some may know as an investigator, we call assessment workers here in the state of Indiana, the expectation is that they would pick right back up that following workday, and referrals would be made that following workday. And then we added a project manager who's a supervisor in the office that checks those removals daily to ensure that no child is lost in the loop. So every time any removals occur, they're following up and they're ensuring that those removals are referred to kinship specialists. They are assigned, and still, as in that previous slide that we just discussed, within 48 hours, those kinship supports are out in that home. They are meeting with families. They are assessing those families for any immediate needs, and those needs are put in place to make sure that that family is being serviced from their perspective in real time, so that we can make sure that that placement remains stable. So we started this project out with a couple of our staffs because Lake County is a very large county. We have about 9 assessment teams. We have almost 300 staff. As I mentioned before, we have served as upwards as 2,800 families in care. We're down to about 1,000. So we wanted to make sure that this was something that we could do and be successful at it. So we started off with gradually doing this process, and then we went into full implementation in July. So let's see where we went from there. Part of what we were able to do, and we were very blessed to have this opportunity, is for Casey Family Systems to train our staff. And so many people have already talked about the work of Dr. Crumley. And as we all know, Dr. Crumley has retired. We were able, through Casey, to use his trainings, and Fred Harris, who is contracted through Casey, actually facilitated some of Dr. Crumley's work, but he also used a racial equity lens to add to these trainings to discuss with our staffs the necessity of kinship placements, to talk about some of the projections and transference and its impact on kinship care and its placement outcomes. He challenged common stereotypes and myths, such as that statement about the apple not falling too far from the tree. He examined situations about guilt and guilt from relatives and why that may be. He talked about loss and ambivalence and loyalty issues with kinship families. When we very first started talking about these issues in our multidisciplinary teams, a lot of this subject matter came up. A lot of our staff's hesitancies to place with kinship families was because they felt like kinship families had this loyalty to their bio family members, the bio parents. And as a lot of us already know that work in this field, who wouldn't? Why wouldn't we have those loyalties and those ties to those who we are raised with and connected to? That's only natural, right? And so we do live in this, and I think Gilbert talked about it on our lunch break, is that we kind of live in this almost bipolar relationship where we expect people to not have those affiliations and somehow be able to shut it off and disconnect, but then be able to connect to the bio parent's child. And so he challenged those, and he was able to do it in some small discussion groups. And then he added that race equity lens, which we really needed him to be able to add that component and talk about that needed piece of how this affects children of color and how it affects African-American children. We know by and large that a lot of our connections are informal. Gilbert started us off when kinship, his presentation of talking about how it was affected in his family. And I'm sure that some of us either know someone or are impacted in some way by having kinship relations or knowing someone that was informally raised by someone else. And this happens so often. Why would it not be something that would be utilized by our formalized system to help strengthen families? So in this training survey that we did, I used 2 cohorts to do this survey, but I am happy to say that our entire staff in Lake County have now been trained under Fred Harris and his training competencies. But this 45 participant training group was in 2 cohorts, and they attended 3 training sessions that were completed by Fred. So some of the outcomes from this training survey is that by and large, over 85% of the people that attended disagreed that kinship care is only considered when there's no other placement option. I should say also that all staff were trained in this, our clerical team, our case managers, our supervisors, everyone that is a part of staff here. A little less than half agreed or strongly agreed that children placed in kinship care have better outcomes. So as you can see, there's still a lot of work to be done here, because we know that kids that are in kinship care have less trauma with removals, that they do have better outcomes for permanency. So we still have a lot of work to do there. About a third are not sure what they believe when it comes to whether kinship caregivers tend to side with birth parents. I think that there's still some work to do there, just because in our initial surveys, there were a lot of beliefs around kinship families and their loyalties to birth families. About 22% of participants believe that kinship families had it easier when they were providing care for bio families' kids. And so there wasn't a lot of people that believe that, but I do still think there's enough that believe that for us to still do some work in that area. But more than half walked away with a better understanding of what is required to be a kinship caregiver. So we do think that overall that training did really help impact staff. So some of the data pool was from our data and analysis team. They did a lot of data cleaning on our data, just omitting kids that weren't in placement for 30 days. So the post-intervention only included 77 kids, but we had a very good team that also included, and our data team was a very good team as well, but we included our raw data and we uploaded it in Hova and Hoover, and later we're going to show our aggregate data as well. So the next slide will show a little bit of how our data impacted this, the outcome of our survey. So going back to this initial slide, one of the things that we are very blessed to have happened during this time is that, as you can see, the number of children that wound up being removed during this project year for African American children has dramatically decreased. Only 39% of children, African American children, were removed during this time. And then the numbers of relative placements for kids has slightly decreased during this time, but we believe that that is due to the fact that our removals have dramatically decreased at this time. Our removals for Caucasian children has slightly increased during this time. And we do have some theories about what has caused that, which I'll discuss in the upcoming slides. So when we look at kinship care, when we look at the impact of the increase, our overall increase at this time is almost 20% when we look at the impact of the increase. These numbers, like I mentioned before, have never been more than 1/3. Part of that 39% that you're seeing is our numbers that include January to May, which was included in this placement, or our pre-intervention numbers, and pulling our numbers from 2016 up until December of last year, we maintained 32.3% of relative placement, and we hit over the 40% mark this year. So we are very grateful that more of our kids are being able to experience being with family and having less trauma this year. We are just extremely excited about that. What we were able to deduce from our impact of this intervention is that we can't really determine whether long-term goals are going to be or how it's going to be affected. We really do want to see if the children that we're looking at from July will actually receive more timely permanency. We do know that just from our hotline information that we got higher acuity reports, and we're looking to see if that variable has caused an increase in the type of removals that we did and in the socioeconomic status of those removals, and if that impacted race. So that is what we're looking at when we're looking at if the effects of the removals of race impacted, or if COVID-19 has impacted that due to the high acuity of removals that we had this year. Oh my goodness. Well, before I get to the impact of MPLD journey, I just wanted to mention, I believe that Arlene may have put a handout that I was going to have in Hoover into the chat. And the one thing that I wanted to share from that handout was that for the removals that we did have of African-American children in the year 2020, in 2019, it was 1 in every 5 children were being placed with family. This year, 1 in every 2 children were being placed with family. And that our demographics of children in care went from 63% of our children in care were African-American in 2019, which they are 17% of the population, and now they make up 58% of children in care. So that is on the handout that's being shown. The impact of this MPLD journey. So the first thing I'd like to share is that this truly has challenged some structural concepts for me in how I believe that what leadership meant. I believed truly that as a leader, it was the role of a leader to do hard work and keep your head down and to just work hard. And I had a lot of cultural concepts about that I think that systemic racism really impacted. Cheryl Lynn is absolutely amazing with data, and Arlene really is, I can't say enough about how phenomenal she is, and they will make you uncomfortable. And so if you couple that with Ellis, who not only during MPLD, but before MPLD and after MPLD and throughout MPLD, who has constantly been challenging some beliefs and concepts. And then I'm not saying this just because she's on the line, but Terry Stigdon is the epitome of an amazing Black woman. She talks and walks the walk. For her to be our state director, she got in this thing with me and literally helped me to finish my project. So I truly do feel like she is absolutely a rock star. I know that I shared with Game Changers, because you know you guys are the bomb, that I didn't even plan on sharing that I am not only a first generation college student, but I am proud to be my father's child, my parents' child, that I am the youngest of older generational parents who did not have an opportunity to finish school, to attend high school, that grew up in Jim Crow era. And so, but they worked very hard to put their children through school. And so I stand on their shoulders, and I am very grateful for that. But I believe this program is very needed to help understand for others the need to be able to sit in a room and to have contributions to offer. I thank everyone for their insights and sharing their journey. And so I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.